There is no box to think out of.
Explore new ideas, become inspired, and consider breakthrough concepts. Speaker list and ticket information at TEDxOrangeCoast.com.
This place has got really good chocolate shakes.
What she said to me, I was so
That's a good look for you.
That was fun.
Yeah. Let me help you out with it.
Oh no, I got it.
You sure?
Just pop the trunk.
I may not know where the road will lead, but I'm sure my Subaru will get me there.
Love. It's what makes a Subaru a Subaru.
I've been a bad kid my whole life.
Found guilty of a near-fatal shooting, Jimmy Moran awaits his sentence. What can brain science tell us that might affect his fate? I'm Alan Alda. I'll see you in court.
Coming up next on PBS SoCal.
You'd be surprised how many folks you wouldn't know they had a mental illness at all. They've owned homes, they've had successful careers.
The label has lifelong stigma for the person who received the label.
People do recover from mental illness. Right now I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment. I have 2 puppies.
Life goes on after mental illness, and in fact it can even be better.
See the whole story at eachmindmatters.org.
You're watching PBS SoCal, PBS for Greater Los Angeles.
Hello, I'm Alan Alda. This is the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where we've been filming the trial of a young man accused of the all-too-common crime of robbing a convenience store. A robbery that in this case turned into a tragedy.
I need it right now. Money now. Give us some cash right.
Startled by the sudden appearance of the store owner's wife, Jimmy Moran fired a shot that left her with a grievous brain injury. The crime is fictitious.
All right, we'll call the case of People versus Moran.
But during the emotional trial of the character Jimmy Moran, the case was argued before a very real and distinguished federal judge by practicing attorneys.
The defendant, Jimmy Moran, is holding his gun.
Everything that happens here happens in a matter of less than 10 seconds.
During the course of filming the trial, we took breaks from the courtroom to explore how neuroscience, in particular the ability to look into people's heads with powerful brain scanning machines, may one day be employed in a real trial. We saw how brain scans could potentially reveal whether someone has told a lie. You want to find out if I did?
I do.
Whether an eyewitness remembers a face, or if a defendant has the crime scene etched in his brain.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Our trial concluded its first phase with the jury clearing Jimmy Moran of attempted murder, but finding him guilty of armed robbery and aggravated assault. The jury's job is done, and now it's up to the judge to decide on a punishment that fits the crime. How much blame should Jimmy take for what he did? How responsible is he for the devastating brain injury he caused? What does he deserve? Judges are already beginning to turn to brain science for answers to these questions. In our fictional case, we'll see how that science is providing unprecedented insights into the minds of young people like our defendant. And why his age, his troubled childhood, even the mere presence of his friends, can all conspire to push him into foolish and reckless acts.
Major funding for Brains on Trial was provided by
The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting original research and public understanding of science, technology, and economics.
Additional funding was provided by the Cheryl and Philip Milstein family.
So, counsel, welcome back. I'm glad you're here for the sentencing hearing, and I understand that defense counsel wishes to offer some live testimony. So let's hear from defense counsel.
From the outset, Your Honor, I think it's absolutely clear that in this case,
we have a very young offender. We have a defendant who was convicted 2 weeks into his 18th birthday. If this event took place 2 weeks earlier, these proceedings would have been in family court, and there would have been a whole panoply of social services involved in evaluating his conduct.
As defense counsel Tony Rico points out, Jimmy turned 18 just days before the crime. That means he's being tried as an adult. But does he have an adult's brain? The question prompted my trip to the National Institutes of Health, where Jay Geed has some key collaborators in his explorations of the adolescent brain.
My son Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
Nice to meet you. My daughter Sasha.
Hi, Sasha.
My children and study participants. So
you've been scanning them.
Yes, I've been watching their brains grow and develop through the years.
From what age?
From 3 and from 5.
I'm really eager to look inside your brain. Is one of you going to be able to show us your brain today?
I guess I will.
Okay, great. So let's take a look and put him in the scanner. That'd be great. This is Jordan's 10th time in his father's scanner. His sister Sasha has been scanned over 20 times. And together they've contributed to an unprecedented picture of how the makeup of a young brain changes as it matures. Can you show me how that changed in Jordan's brain over the years?
We can from...
You've been photographing, you've been scanning him for a long time now.
So this is...
what age did he start at?
So this
Can you hold that for us?
It goes from ages 3 to 25. And it's actually combining people across different chunks of
this is not just Jordan.
Right, but it's actually part of it. Our is actually in this one. And what we see in these colors is blue can be seen as maturation in the sense it's getting closer to the adult brain. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is this part of the brain right here.
Here?
Yeah, the last to turn blue.
Right.
And this is the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, and involved in impulse control, long-range planning, the kind of the hard stuff, integrating everything to make decisions.
That's the part that should come in first. The maturation of the adolescent brain involves the pruning away of its gray matter, the nerve cells themselves, and the growing of its white matter, which is the cabling that connects the nerve cells. The cables themselves get better as they become wrapped with insulation called myelin, enabling them to transmit information hundreds of times faster. It's this improved connectivity of fewer, more specialized nerve cells that makes a brain mature, with the crucial decision-making front of the brain the last to join in. Now, where would Sasha be along this thing? Sasha, you're a couple of years older?
Yeah, 19, 2 years older.
Yeah, okay. So exactly 2.5 years apart. The twist on this, though, is that females tend to hit these peaks about 2 years earlier than males as well. So for Sasha, we need to go a little bit further than 2 years. And so we still see a little bit of non-blue in these areas, but it is farther along.
Sasha, do you have this picture on your Facebook page?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I think you'd get a lot of friends with that.
But it is interesting as well that these are averages.
Yeah.
And both in brain and in behavior, we see some young people, 12, 13, 14, that are very responsible, not impulsive, make good decisions, and we see people our age, older, who never pick that up.
So Jimmy's brain could simply not yet be wired up for good decision-making. As far as our court is concerned, though, he's over 18, so his brain age is irrelevant. But as I learned during one of our timeouts from the trial with law professor Nita Farahani, this is an area that neuroscience is already beginning to influence.
Judges are really starting to take into account the evidence of the developing brain in order to determine what is a just sentence. In several Supreme Court decisions in a row, the court has had to address this question of, when it gets to the point of sentencing, is it just to treat juveniles in the same way that we treat adults? They're not the kind of incorrigible criminal defendant. They're somebody who is likely to be very different several years from now than they are today. That it is cruel and unusual punishments to punish them as we would an adult under the same circumstances. And so it's unconstitutional to have the death penalty for juveniles. It's unconstitutional to have life without the possibility of parole for a non-homicide case. But our defendant is just over 18. And the criminal justice system, as well as the legal system generally, draws these really hard and bright lines.
This doesn't seem to make sense because, again, we seem to know from experience, within a family, one kid will become very mature at a much earlier age than another kid in the same family.
Right.
And when you broaden that to the whole population, how can you say on a certain birthday you now are going to be judged as an adult? But does that seem fair?
Well, especially if we're trying to calibrate it to something like your developing brain.
Yeah.
It really doesn't make any sense at all. So 18 is not a magic cutoff. In fact, if we were going to put a magic cutoff somewhere, it should be in your late 20s, because it seems like that's actually when the brain becomes fully myelinated and fully developed.
Maybe it should be tied to whether or not you're still living with your parents.
Maybe. We should have it tied to something like that instead of just some arbitrary age cutoff. But, these things I think are all, up for grabs as to what are we going to have our criminal justice system look like in the future when we have better science and a better understanding of human nature. Does it really make sense to do things the way that we've been doing things today, or should we think about them differently? And with our defendant being just over 18 is kind of the perfect example, because if he could have had a far different sentence if he was 18 years and a day old than 2 days prior, that doesn't seem like a particularly sensible or just outcome.
The defense calls Dr. Baer.
Please raise your right
Back at the trial, the next witness is the court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Baer.
What did you find about Jimmy's judgment and decision-making capacity?
Well, they're complicated by the fact that when he was young, he was diagnosed with a learning disability and cognitive slow processing speed, which means that he wasn't able to process information at a rapid pace. He was placed in special education from the second grade on. When I interviewed his guidance counselor and the special ed director, they said in the senior year, he was functioning at about the level of a seventh grader, academically, emotionally, and socially. And I think that does have relevance to his ability to process information, make decisions, and his degree of impulsivity.
Well, now, impulsiveness is sort of a classic trait of adolescence. What was different in this case?
It's true, it's typical of teenagers, but it's especially true of teenagers who have slow cognitive processing speed and are under heightened arousal, emotional arousal. They don't process even the way a normal adolescent would. So they're more vulnerable in those kinds of situations. I think what happened was that he was startled, turned the gun, and it fired. He didn't intend to do it. He didn't take aim. He didn't pause. It just happened in an instant.
As Judge Rakoff observed, impulsiveness is a classic adolescent trait. Was Jimmy's 18-year-old brain simply unable to control his recklessly impulsive act?
So this is our testing room here.
To find out how a somewhat older brain can control its impulses, I've come to the University of Pittsburgh and the lab of Bea Luna.
Yeah, so sit here, but first look at me so I can explain to you a little bit what we're going to do. What we're testing here are your eye movements, and specifically saccades, which is, in fact, the fastest motor movement that the human body can make.
The saccade just means an eye movement.
So what we're going to do is that I'm going to show you a fixation target. Just look at it. All of a sudden, it's going to go off, and the light's going to appear somewhere. You don't know where it is. And what I want you to do is to look to the opposite location. So it should be something like this. You're going to look at it, a light will appear, and you look the other way.
Okay.
And let me assure you, monkeys are really good at this test.
They are? Oh, well, then in
It
that
takes about 6 months of training.
I'm in now. I'm going to do great.
Well, perhaps I'm not so great. It's proving surprisingly hard to drag my eyes away from the light. Right. You know what this is like? I feel like I'm the boy in the story, and when that yellow light comes in on the left side of the screen or the right side of the screen, I feel like it's the clerk's wife coming into the room, and I can't help but turn to it and shoot a glance at her.
The visual system, the brainstem is all wired up, the attentional system, to look at something that appears in the environment.
Yeah.
That's what our brain wants to do. So in order for us to not do that, you have to engage executive regions that will say, even though you really want to do that, rest of the brain, I have a plan in executive regions, and our plan is not to look at that. So it's a way for us to be able to look at the integrity of the brain, to be able to engage a plan and take over the impulsive areas of the brain, which is something that develops with, throughout adolescence.
Right. Bea Luna recently began an ambitious research project to find out just what an adolescent brain is doing as it readies itself to resist impulsive acts. 18-year-old Catalina will be taking the eye movement challenge, this time while her brain's electrical activity is being monitored. So her head is going into a magnetic device? What is that?
Yes, so the MEG is going to be lowered onto her head. And all it is that, she has these electrodes, and the actual MEG machine has other types of coils that are able to receive the electrical information that's coming from the surface of the cortex.
The bowl over Catalina's head contains 306 electrodes, recording what's going on as her brain mobilizes the resources to resist looking at the light. Early results suggest that for a few fractions of a second before the light comes on, the parietal and prefrontal regions have been talking back and forth, and that the more those conversations have become synchronized, the better Catalina is able to resist her impulse to glance at the light. You're looking to see it not be so efficient, not so well synchronized, for instance, at a certain age, and then as development takes place, it gets better and better synchronized and better, more efficient. Is that what you're finding?
This is a new study, and that is the hypothesis that's driving a lot of our work.
Jimmy's crime involved yelling and screaming to intimidate the clerk, a rush of emotion that may have contributed to his impulsiveness. Catalina has once more volunteered her adolescent brain to find out if emotional arousal interferes with the brain's ability to gear itself up to resist looking at the light.
During that preparatory period, we're going to be presenting emotional sounds, because we also know that during the adolescent period, there's this hypersensitivity to emotion.
So this should be emotional, yeah. No, it didn't. See, that didn't get me. I'm used to babies
me as
crying.
a mother, I am like, I immediately want to go and take care of that.
Yeah. That got me. That's a chipmunk brushing his teeth.
Does that take you back to MASH?
No, that's the call to the horses at a horse race.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It took me back to when I was an out-of-work actor, betting at the racetrack. This is another new study of Bea's, and the results aren't in yet. But it's likely that young subjects like Catalina will be less able to control their impulse to look at the light when distracted by emotional sounds.
The defense would call Miss Hope Brown.
At the trial, the next witness will introduce another element neuroscience is uncovering as contributing to crimes like Jimmy's: the fact that friends were involved.
Please raise your right
Hope
hand.
Brown took Jimmy in when his father threw him out on discovering he was hanging out with a drug gang.
Miss Brown, tell Judge Rakoff, how is it that you came to know Jimmy?
My daughter Melody was dating him, and she's was almost 18, so there's not much you can say. He seemed like a nice young man, and came a time when he had gotten kicked out of his home, and Melody had come to me and said, can he stay with us?
Did you ever have a reason to be concerned with Jimmy's friends?
Yeah, I mean, one of the deals that I made with Jimmy and Melody when he moved in was that he had to leave whatever behavior behind. So that also meant that he should not associate with any friends that he had had before.
In the few weeks up until the time of, at the time Jimmy was arrested, did you notice if the old friends were starting to come around? And was he getting phone calls or anything like that?
I didn't see any of his old friends, but we were getting some phone calls late at night. If I picked up, somebody would hang up. So there was definitely something going on out of the ordinary.
Is there anything that you would like to say to Judge Rakoff as a parent that the court may want to consider and making an assessment of the sentence to be imposed?
You know, I don't think Jimmy had a good start. And I think that's part of the reason why we wanted to take him into our home. And when I first met Jimmy, he seemed a little broken. You know, Jimmy was a follower. And Jimmy wanted people to like him. Probably more so than always making the right decision.
Jimmy was with his old drug gang friends, of course, when he attempted to rob the convenience store. How much did their presence contribute to his decision to shoot? I'm about to make a life or death decision myself. Fortunately, only a virtual one. I'm at Temple University in Philadelphia, playing the stoplight game.
I don't think so. It just saved my life.
We've all had the experience of trying to get someplace in a hurry, approaching an intersection, hitting a yellow light, and making a last-minute decision about whether we want to go through or not.
Right.
And that's what this does.
Oh, I would have made that for sure. I'm gonna go through this. I made it again. Oh, no, okay. Oh, so I get this broken windshield. That's probably my head that made this dent.
A more typical participant in the stoplight game is a teenager playing like Alex here while lying in an MRI machine.
Yeah, he made it through the first one without getting killed. He seems kind of lucky with these. I would have stopped.
Alex is deciding whether to put speed ahead of safety while he's alone in the scanner. But that, as far as Alex believes, is about to change.
Hey Alex, how you doing? Good. I have your friends here, and they're gonna be watching you play the next round of tasks, so they're gonna talk to you a little bit, okay?
Okay, cool.
All right, you can just press that button.
Hey Alex, you still alive in there? Oh yeah. Nice.
Go ahead.
Hey Alex, it's Paul. How's it going?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm good, man. Good luck in there. We're gonna be watching you.
They're gonna be watching me?
Actually, they won't. But Alex doesn't know that. As far as he's concerned, his friends are watching his every choice.
Crash. Bang.
Is it my imagination, or is he having a few more crashes this time?
No, he is having more crashes, and that's what we find, that when adolescents play this game, they crash more often when they know their friends are watching them than they do when they're by themselves.
What happens with adults when they're with friends or alone? Is there that much difference with adults?
There's no difference at all
Really?
in how they behave or in their patterns of brain activity. So when adults are alone and adolescents are alone, they look very similar. It's when you put adolescents with their friends that their behavior and their brain pattern changes.
The brain pattern change is in the regions that respond to reward, principally in an area called the ventral striatum. When young people are alone playing the game, the ventral striatum remains quiet. But with friends around, it lights up.
During adolescence, peers are so important that their presence activates the brain's reward circuitry, and that makes adolescents, under that condition, pay more attention to the potential rewards of a risky choice and less attention to the potential downside.
Oh, bravo, you did a great job. Your friends are proud of you. Just don't get in the car with them.
I've always assumed teenagers drive dangerously because friends in the car actively distract them. But
Just thinking the friends are watching and observing them, not even passing judgment positively on their behavior.
It's something about the inherent rewarding value of people your age when you're an adolescent. And I think this has implications for understanding adolescent criminal behavior as well. Adolescents are much more likely than adults to commit crimes when they're in groups. And this research, I think, suggests that one of the reasons that happens is that this effect of peers on reward sensitivity may also play a role in adolescents' judgment and decision-making when they're in potentially criminal situations.
At Jimmy's sentencing hearing, it's now the prosecution's turn.
Your Honor, one of the primary victims of the crime, Mr. El-Oz, would like to address the court.
All right. Ahmad El-Oz is the store clerk whose wife Jimmy shot.
Your Honor, I just want to tell you and share with the court the impact that of the actions of the defendant had on my family, on my wife, that he had gone down a life that will never be the same. Since April 4th, Cherie has been lying in bed in the hospital with a serious brain injury. Sometimes I feel like she doesn't know what happened to her, although I see a lot of sadness in her eyes. She doesn't recognize the kids, and the doctor advised not to have the kids visit with her for a while now.
What does the doctor say is the prognosis?
I don't know what is the process of her recovery and how long that will take, but I can tell you that she is never going to be back the way she used to be before April 4th. She will never be able to read stories, sing lullabies, take the kids to the beach. She was not just my wife, she was my best friend. She was my life, and I miss her very much. And, Your Honor, I want to ask you to punish this man who did this to us to the fullest extent of the law, because my family is broken. We will never be complete again. Cherie is still lying in the hospital. Thank you so much.
All right. It's now time for the final arguments from counsel. First from the defense.
All right, Mr. Rico.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Throughout this trial, I know Your Honor has paid very close attention to Jimmy. And at the one time in which he shed a tear in this case was not when the conversation was about himself or his family or his background, but when Mr. El-Oz was speaking about his wife. That was a reflection of his sense of a recognition of the damage that was caused by his actions on that night, and I think it was sincere.
Whether or not Judge Rakoff believes in the sincerity of Jimmy's remorse will be important in deciding his sentence. And the question of whether a brain scan could one day recognize an emotion like remorse has brought me to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh to visit with Marcel Just.
We can certainly decode individual thoughts.
Yeah.
And we're sort of working, our aspiration eventually is to be able to decode complex thought.
In our popular imagination, we think of these MRI machines as your chance to read our minds. You're almost doing that, aren't you?
Well, our thoughts are in our brains, certainly, and our brains have activation patterns, and we've trained computer programs to recognize those activation patterns.
To actually recognize the pattern of thought.
Yes.
What's Kara going to be doing in here?
This is a very elementary kind of thought that she's going to be experiencing. She's just going to see letters of the alphabet. W now, she saw W. It retrieves the images.
And the computer's going to figure out what...
W?
W. So, and correct. This is really unbelievable.
In close to real time, the computer voice announces the letter Kara has just seen.
I.
Correct.
The computer reads the thing that happens in her brain when she sees the letter, and the computer says she's seeing an O or she's seeing a D.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Impressive though it may be, decoding the thought of a letter is a very long way from decoding the complexity of an emotion. Which is why Alex Spieth is on her way to the MRI machine.
But I think it's down this way. So what, you're an acting student here?
Yes, I am. I'm a junior at the School of Drama.
Alex has volunteered to be a subject in an experiment to see if Marcel Just's computer algorithms can figure out what she's feeling while lying in the scanner.
She's going to go through a process that she would go through on the stage to call up an emotion. And you're going to tell her what emotions are?
Yes. On the screen, a word will come up like happy.
Yeah.
And then for 3 seconds, she's supposed to conjure up happiness.
The computer then attempts to divine the essence of Alex's happiness so that if it sees the pattern again, it'll predict she's feeling happy. With simple emotions like happiness or disgust, the decoder is showing some promise. But with more complex emotions like jealousy, the computer so far remains baffled. Which brings me back to the question that brought me here.
Would it be possible someday to look inside a specific defendant's brain and determine if they really felt remorse?
I think one could identify remorse-related.
But they could be acting
yeah, what
remorse.
if they're an actor?
This question, whether a brain scan could ever truly plumb someone's mind if they were out to defeat it, is central to whether neuroscience will ever have a role in the courtroom in making judgments about individuals. But the insights of neuroscience into the teenage brain do help explain why young people in general can engage in foolish and dangerous acts. We saw from Jay Geed's studies that a brain like Jimmy's is likely still to be incompletely wired up. From Bea Luna that a teenage brain is unready for the prep work needed to avoid making split-second mistakes, especially in emotionally charged situations. And from Larry Steinberg that reward centers in the teenage brain can be put into high gear when friends are around. All of which raises the question,
are we in danger of saying that as far as culpability is concerned, that he's not really guilty, his brain made him do it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more important sort of debates about how neuroscience can inform the law. That you don't want to get to the level of making this separation of my brain made me do it and not me. That's why I'm always saying it should never be the critical aspect of the law, which is an ethical issue. It should just be an informative piece, as many other informative pieces might be.
So I don't think that we can sort of use it as an excuse to not be accountable, but I think it can influence what we do moving forward, what sort of environment they should be in that keeps society safe, but that the probably worst imaginable would be to put them in with other people that are older and criminals, because this is a time when the brain is looking for peers and modeling to know what to do.
There is no question that punishment has to be imposed in this case.
And in fact, defense attorney Tony Rico is focusing on the immaturity of Jimmy's brain as he makes the case for leniency.
Judge, I've always been concerned about the sentences that are imposed on teenagers. Lengthy sentences for teenagers, we've seen the results of that. They're at the bottom of the food chain in the penitentiaries, and defendants who are young with psychiatric problems are walking around those facilities with bullseyes on them. All the statistics show that they're the victims of abuse, they're the victims of manipulation in prison settings. What I would say to the court is that that doesn't free a defendant from responsibility, but it certainly gives the court a moment to think about where's this young person going.
But Tony Rico's argument that prison would be bad for Jimmy, while certainly true, is likely to be only one of the factors Judge Rakoff will now be considering.
He's about to be sentenced. What is the judge thinking? How is he coming to his decision about punishment, the way we have traditionally thought of punishment?
The criminal justice system for adults generally serves two large purposes. The first one, which seems to be overarching, is retributivism. Now, retributivism is...
Society getting even with the criminal.
Exactly. So it's, that society has a right to punish and a right to respond to the wrongdoing the person has done.
It's a more civilized version of an eye for an eye.
It might not even be that much more civilized, but the idea is that it is, kind of an eye for an eye.
I'm not taking your eye out, but
Right.
I'm giving you 20 years behind bars.
So that's the retributive approach, but that's not it, because we also have deterrence as a principle. And there is general deterrence, which is we want to deter other people in society from committing similar crimes. And so the kind of message that, punishing somebody sends is, if you commit the crime, you will do the time. And then there's specific deterrence. And specific deterrence is we want to deter that person from committing any more crimes. So that's much more effective if what you're talking about is putting them in jail because they're
So you're
unable to
getting
be...
them, removing them from society.
Exactly.
In that case.
Exactly. The question that a lot of people are asking is, when we know more about the brain, when we know more about how people behave and why they do the things that they do, are these models of punishment really the right ones? Some people say no. Some people say what neuroscience is really doing is showing a lot of our behavior is hardwired, and if it's hardwired, it doesn't make sense to blame it. And we need to rethink the way that we do punishment.
One rethinking might be to reduce the emphasis society now places on retribution.
Let me hear now from the government.
Thank you, Your Honor.
But it may also increase the emphasis on deterrence, a point being made by prosecuting counsel Curtis Kinn.
Little insight here. The one thing that we've heard is that this defendant is especially impulsive, not just impulsive like ordinary youth, but especially impulsive and unable to control his actions, which I think counsels then in favor of a longer sentence, because as this court well knows, what you need to consider is protecting this public.
The question of the likely danger Jimmy poses to society is a major factor Judge Rakoff must consider in deciding his sentence. And this brings me from our courtroom in New York to a highway in New Mexico. Along with a mobile MRI scanner, we're on our way to the Western New Mexico Correctional Facility in the company of Kent Keel.
Have you been studying psychopaths the whole time you've been coming here?
I've been studying psychopaths for about 20 years already.
Really?
And certainly been studying them since we started working here, yes.
And when did you start scanning them?
We started scanning them probably in 1995, but we were only able to do about 50 of them in 5 years. That's when we were transporting them from the prison to the university to scan them.
I see. And then you developed a mobile?
And then I had the idea of buying a mobile MRI and doing that. So why don't we pull in through here and get checked through security.
How long have you been coming here?
We've been coming to Western Correctional Facility for the past 5 years.
And in that time, how many inmates have you scanned?
Over 600 who have volunteered for our research and treatment studies.
So they're all volunteers?
Yes, everyone volunteers. We're all completely independent from the Department of Corrections, so the inmates have the freedom to say yes or no whether or not they want to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most do. Yeah. Most do, yeah.
And what's their motivation for doing it?
Most of them are like anybody else. They like to get a picture of their brain.
Yes.
They like to get, they like a chance to talk to somebody and to participate in, 6 to 10 hours, thanks Deanna, 6 to 10 hours of
oh, it's something
testing.
different, huh?
It's something different.
Yeah.
But honestly, most of them tell you that they don't want to be here and they don't want to come back.
Yeah.
And so if there's anything that we could do to try to help prevent that, they're all for it.
Do they get to keep the picture of their brain?
They do get to keep a picture of their brain, and they really like that. They have brain competitions, and they show each other their brains, and mine's bigger than yours. No, it's not. So we see a lot of that from time to time, yeah.
Hi there. Hi. Come on in.
Hey, Mike, thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Before they go into the scanner, the inmates undergo a detailed history and a series of interviews to determine the extent of their psychopathic tendencies.
Psychopathy is a constellation of 20 different traits, and you have to have a majority of those traits. The lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse, they're superficial, they tend to be a little conning and manipulative, and they're very impulsive. And they tend to be hot-headed, and they tend to are verbally aggressive too, and so that ends up getting themselves in quite a bit of trouble. That's why we work with prisoners, is that psychopaths tend to end up congregating in prisons because they make bad decisions and they're impulsive.
Do they have ways of talking that are typical? I mean, can you talk to somebody and get an indication that maybe they are on that spectrum somewhere?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of type of trigger sense phrases and other types of things that they might say and how they...
What would be an example?
Well, one example was one of my favorites. He said that, well, I didn't kill him, the doctors did.
But
I shot him.
I shot him.
I shot
but
him.
The doctors let him die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that wasn't my fault. If
Yeah.
they'd been better doctors, they would have been able to save him.
And the way, he doesn't find anything odd about that
No, he
statement.
finds it odd you don't agree with him.
Yeah.
He looks at you like, well, are you serious? Like, why? I mean, I winged him, you know, like I didn't even really...
I winged him in the heart.
Yeah. But they can fix that stuff now.
Gee, that's
I was just trying to teach him a lesson.
This first scan's going to take about 8 minutes. All I need you to do is keep real still.
The goal of Kent Keel's research is to see if psychopaths not only think differently from the rest of us, but have different brains.
If you look over here, you can see that he's seeing these pictures being presented one at a time on the screen. And then he's asked to rate those pictures, whether or not they have moral content or not. Here's a fight.
Oh, that's a fight. But that's not good.
Right.
And how will he rate that? He thinks that's
4 out of 5.
4 out of 5.
So it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Right? So that depicts a moral violation. Nazi.
Nazi symbol, yeah.
So let's see what he says.
4 out of 5.
4 out of 5. Here's a car flipped over.
Car burning, yeah.
Kind of ambiguous.
It is. Is it an accident or did somebody burn it?
We don't know. So that's...
And he gives it even higher than the Nazi. I think I ought to watch this guy. No, it's a little higher.
Don't worry, we will. Making a decision about a moral judgment usually requires cognition and most of us emotion.
Yeah.
And we think the psychopath makes the decision with cognition, but not with emotion.
That's right.
And so what we're studying is how his brain helps him make that decision. What we found is that basically the more psychopathic they are, the limbic system in the brain, the emotional circuitry in the brain, is just less dense.
So Kent Keel's research suggests that the reason psychopaths rely less on emotion in making moral judgments is because the emotional centers of their brains are underdeveloped, and that this can be revealed in a brain scan.
If somebody is scanned and it's determined that he's psychopathic, is that good for him or bad for him in the long run?
Usually it's bad. Usually psychopathy, because it predicts recidivism, would be considered a thing that would be hard to get rid of, a label that can be bad for them. Psychopathy is one of those risk factors that tends to be very successful at predicting who does and doesn't get in trouble.
Recently, Kent has refined his ability to predict who might get into trouble even further, focusing on an area within the emotional centers of the brain called the anterior cingulate. He found that low activity of this region in a test of impulsivity doubled the chances of a released inmate being rearrested. So for offenders like Jimmy, already with many of the risk factors for getting into trouble again, brain scans might also one day play a role in helping the judge assess his future dangerousness. But that still leaves the other big reason, perhaps the biggest reason society punishes people: retribution.
Because at the end of the day, it is what is a just punishment here. And I think in doing that, you have to look at the harm that was caused, the measure of harm. Miss El-Oz is never able again to walk, and her family is forever changed. And I think the sentence that this court imposes needs to give some measure of comfort and some measure of peace to the victims. As you heard from Mr. El-Oz, he has requested that this court punish the defendant to the fullest extent of the law. And I would submit, Your Honor, that a lengthier sentence is necessary here to reflect the severity of the defendant's conduct, to protect society from his impulsivity, and to be just here.
Does the defendant wish to make a statement?
Yes, I do. Your Honor, I guess it's part of your job to be told how sorry people are. So I've been thinking about what else I can tell you, and I thought that I could tell you a little bit about what this experience has been like for me. The time I was arrested and brought into custody, felt like another step downward in the way that my life had been going. I've been a bad kid my whole life. Drugs, and not a good kid in school. It's always been a part of it, and it seemed like another step down that road, and sometimes I felt like that was the only road that was available for me. But arriving here, I met Mr. Rico, and I heard from Melody and her mom, Dr. Bear. And they were on my side. I guess for the first time in my life, it felt like people believed in me, believed that I could not be like that anymore. And not a day goes by I don't think about what happened to Mr. Alaz and his wife. And I know that I'm responsible for what happened, and that's why I'm sorry. And I can only hope that you take into account that I feel like, and other people feel like I have something to live for. So please be lenient to me when you consider your sentence. Thank you.
Thanks very much. All right. The court is prepared to impose sentence. All judges view sentencing as by far the most difficult part of their job, because there you have in your hands the future of a fellow human being.
We have one last question about the brains in our courtroom.
None of us has
And that's what's going on in Judge Rakoff's brain as he wrestles with his decision about Jimmy's fate.
wisdom.
Good luck.
Thank
Have
you.
fun.
Federal Appeals Court Judge Gilbert Merritt is about to have his brain scanned while he makes punishment decisions. He's the 17th judge to volunteer for a study of judges' brains here at Vanderbilt University in Nashville.
We've been incredibly fortunate and excited by seeing how much the judges care about this study and how willing they are to participate.
Do they have a feeling, do you sense, that they're really helping the justice system by understanding the brain better through these tests?
Yeah, they're really curious. It's like they want to know what goes on in their mind.
Okay, Your Honor, we're going to go ahead and get started with the task now.
Judge Merritt will be reading scenarios of crimes and rating his punishment decision on a scale of 0 to 9. Previous research by the Vanderbilt team has suggested that judges tend to put more weight than lay people on the intent of an offender than on the harm he or she caused.
If you see the judge paying more attention to the intent of the wrongdoer and the layperson paying more attention to the harm done, isn't that because some part of the brain in one is more active than it is in the other person? Otherwise, they wouldn't come to a different decision, would they?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Like, have you identified that difference?
Not yet. We're still acquiring data as we are doing today, and we need a lot of subjects to be able to distinguish these, what I think will be subtle differences.
Leaving Judge Merritt to settle in for a grueling hour or more in the scanner.
Ready?
I find myself lending a hand in an ongoing study of a part of the brain the Vanderbilt team has already identified as probably playing a role in punishment decisions.
Okay, this is the left ear?
Yep.
Boom.
Graduate student Sonia Polteratsky will be having a region in the front of her brain zapped by a series of powerful magnetic pulses. This region, a small spot in her right prefrontal cortex, appears to become active while people are deciding whether a harmful act deserves to be punished.
Now tell me something. This seems a little eerie. What kind of a pulse is she getting? She's getting a magnetic pulse.
Yes.
And you know it's harmless, right? I mean, no long-lasting effect, but you're knocking out the use of a little part of her brain.
That's right.
So, Sonia, you're about to get a few Tesla right through the head. How do you feel about that?
As good as one can feel about that. No, I've been in several studies before, and I conduct research myself, so I know that it is harmless in the long run and beneficial for knowledge, so I'm okay with the little face twitch for that.
Does that feel pretty comfortable, Sonia? Great. There'll be a 5-second delay, and then you'll start feeling the pulses.
Oh, she felt the pulse, huh?
The train of pulses continues for a half an hour. Its effect is to knock out that small spot on the surface of Sonia's brain for about another 15 or 20 minutes after the zapping ends.
Sonia, do you feel any different in that part of your head now? Can you feel anything?
I don't. Yeah,
No,
I
just-
feel
you
totally
just feel
fine.
normal.
Mhm.
So the difference is supposed to come out when you answer these questions.
Yeah, I guess.
Sonia is presented with a series of scenarios similar to the ones Judge Merritt is reading in the scanner, and also rating them on a scale of 1 to 9.
Mary is particularly proud of and attached to her current puppy. This sounds like bad news for the puppy. Well, as he sneaks into Mary's yard and kidnaps the puppy. When Mary goes to the dog house the next morning and finds her puppy gone, she's horrified, and she becomes depressed. What do you think of that? Anything? Would you give him anything for that?
I think I would give him a 5 for that. So he didn't do anything particularly violent, but I do have a soft spot in my heart for puppies.
Right. And all he wants is love, right?
Yeah.
I mean, poor guy.
Surprisingly, subjects like Sonia punish crimes less when this region in the prefrontal cortex is disabled, possibly because it's less able to piece together information coming from the rest of the brain, including regions involved in emotion. Rene Marois believes his research in fact points to an important role for emotion in the way people make decisions about punishment.
So possibly your work might point to the idea that including an emotional element might give you a fairer decision than just being purely rational?
We think so.
Uh-huh. That's a really counterintuitive idea, isn't it?
Yes. There's quite a mounting evidence that suggests that emotion really is one heuristic by which we come up with the decisions to punish and how much to punish.
Judge Merritt's session in the scanner, during which he'd handed out mostly 1s on the 0 to 9 scale, is finally over.
I didn't do enough punishing.
It'll take many more volunteers like him to really pick apart the workings of a judge's brain.
Dizzy, yeah, it takes
But in his case, it certainly seems that his judgments were colored by emotion.
Do you tend to, in real life, to give many 1s? I mean, or do you have a cutoff point? You say?
I would say I'm a lenient judge.
Yes.
Yes.
And what's behind that? Is it just a whole lot of compassion, or is it out of a lot of reasoning that you've arrived at that?
People are by no means perfect. You know, we have to take into account we have flaws that are very deep in all of us, have significant flaws, and so we ought not to get over-legalized.
You sound like a really unusual, non-judgmental judge.
I try to be a human being first.
That's great. And I wouldn't mind coming up before you. Next, if I ever get in trouble, I'm going to look for you.
I don't believe that's going to happen.
Here we are with all our own frailties being called upon to...
In our trial, Jimmy Moran is awaiting the working out in Judge Rakoff's brain of the competing factors that will decide his sentence.
Now, the witnesses I heard from today have convinced the court that this defendant is far from a hardened criminal. He is not someone society should write off or lose hope in altogether, and that it seems reasonable to assume that prison will not be a good learning experience for Mr. Moran. And yet, as even very able defense counsel recognizes, some prison has to be imposed here. Some substantial prison, perhaps. And why is that? Well, partly it is one, I think, very central to civilized society, which is the vindication of the moral order. But there's something more immediate, and that is the terrible thing that has happened to the victim of this crime. They're really the victims, for it's the whole family. Right now, the woman that Mr. Moran shot point blank in the head is like a prisoner in her own body. And she is imprisoned in that way because of the reckless, knowing, intentional acts of the defendant. And it would be a denial of what this world is all about, not to visit that terrible crime with a substantial punishment. So, the sentence of the court is that the defendant is sentenced to 12 years in prison. That is far less than I think many judges would impose in this situation. I am guided by the point made by defense counsel, which is also reflected in the statutes of this jurisdiction, that the sentence should be no more than it is necessary than to fulfill the various purposes of sentencing.
Well, what do you think? Did Jimmy, the defendant in our fictional trial, get what he deserves? Judge Rakoff, in our case, made his decision based on his own instincts and insights and experiences. But increasingly, judges are calling in the sort of brain scanning evidence we've seen and helping them assess a defendant's culpability and deciding on a punishment that both fits the crime and serves the greater good. Meanwhile, brain science is giving us insight into why people, especially young people like Jimmy, get themselves into trouble. And that should perhaps be making us rethink what a trial like this is trying to achieve, what we mean by justice. Some people who have thought long and hard about these questions have been here in the courtroom watching our trial. I'm going to be sitting down and talking with them, and I hope you'll join us over on the web.
Major funding for Brains on Trial was provided by
the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting original research and public understanding of science, technology, and economics.
Additional funding was provided by the Cheryl and Philip Milstein family. Continue investigating Brains on Trial online at pbs.org/brainsontrial. Brains on Trial is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Be more. PBS.
I'm Ann Police.
And I'm Ed Arnold.
Tonight at 12:30 on Real Orange, supervisors get conservative when it comes to an appointment to the Orange County Pension Board.
How losses on the field affect the financial box score for the Angels.
Workers reconnect a major traffic artery for commuters in Seal Beach.
And military veterans find strength and support on the home front.
Join us for those stories.